The plastic grocery bags cut into Yosef Amit's fingers as he walked across the parking lot toward his car. March 24th, 1986, Haifa. The Mediterranean wind carried salt and diesel fumes through the concrete structure. He heard the engines first, 3 vehicles moving fast, their tires squealing as they cornered up the ramp. White police vans. They formed a triangle around him, blocking every exit. Amit stopped walking. The groceries hung at his sides. Officers poured out, hands on their weapons, moving with the precision of men who'd rehearsed this exact moment. One of them shouted his name. He didn't run. He knew better. His briefcase was locked in the trunk of his Peugeot, 15 meters away, and inside that briefcase were documents that would end careers, expose operations, and destroy the intelligence sharing relationship between Israel and the United States. He had perhaps 90 seconds before they searched his vehicle and found everything. Before we find out what happened in those 90 seconds, I want to let you know what this channel is all about. Every day I bring you real espionage stories, not Hollywood fiction, but actual operations, genuine tradecraft, and the human cost behind the intelligence game. This is the story of Yosef Amit, a decorated Israeli military intelligence officer who became a double agent for an ally, not an enemy. It's a case that was kept secret for 7 years under military censorship, and even today, massive parts of the story remain classified. If you are fascinated by the shadowy world of intelligence agencies, the moral complexities of espionage, and cases that challenge everything you think you know about loyalty and betrayal, hit that subscribe button right now. Trust me, what happens next with Amit is just the beginning, and the revelations coming will show you how even the closest allies spy on each other in ways that would shock most people. All right, back to that parking lot in Haifa. Amit's hands were still holding those grocery bags. The lead officer stepped forward and identified himself as Shin Bet. Internal security, not regular police. Amit's mouth went dry. They told him to put down the bags and place his hands on the hood of the nearest van. He complied without speaking. The metal was cold under his palms. One officer patted him down while another photographed the scene, and a third retrieved keys from Amit's jacket pocket. They moved to his Peugeot. The trunk popped open with a mechanical click that echoed through the concrete structure. Amit closed his eyes. He knew what they'd find. Manila folders, photocopied documents marked with classification stamps, intelligence assessments about Israeli troop movements in Lebanon and the occupied territories. Materials he'd obtained through lies, materials he'd been passing to American intelligence handlers for months. The officer searching the trunk called out to his supervisor. They'd found the briefcase. Amit was 41 years old, and his life was over. They cuffed his hands behind his back, the metal biting into his wrists, and guided him into the back of one of the vans. The door slammed shut. No sirens. They drove in silence through Haifa streets, taking a route designed to avoid attention. And Amit stared at the floor between his feet while the van's engine hummed beneath him. 20 minutes later, they arrived at a facility he recognized, but had never entered as a prisoner. The interrogation room smelled like cigarette smoke and floor cleaner. A metal table, 2 chairs, fluorescent lights that buzzed with electrical current. They sat him down and left him alone for 3 hours. Standard procedure. Let him think. Let him imagine what comes next. When the interrogator finally entered, he didn't introduce himself. He placed a folder on the table and opened it slowly, the paper rustling in the silent room. Inside were photographs of Amit meeting with men in Bonn, West Germany. Surveillance photos from the past 6 months. Amit recognized his own face in every image, and he recognized the face of the man sitting across from him in those German cafes. A CIA officer operating under diplomatic cover. The interrogator asked one question. When did it start? Amit's mind went back 2 years. Haifa again, but a different setting. The port district, a bar frequented by foreign naval officers when their ships made port. He'd been working as a private investigator after his military service ended, taking contract work that paid better than his government pension. The work was legitimate but small scale, mostly insurance fraud and corporate due diligence. One evening in that bar, he met an American naval officer who bought him a drink. They talked about the Mediterranean, about port security, about nothing that seemed important. The conversation was friendly and forgettable. Amit thought nothing of it until 3 weeks later when the same officer approached him again and suggested they meet for coffee. The second meeting was different. The American asked specific questions about Amit's background, his military service, his current work. Amit answered some and deflected others, but the American was skilled at keeping the conversation comfortable, non-threatening. At the end of that coffee meeting, the American handed Amit a business card with a phone number. Said he had friends in Europe who might have investigative work that paid well if Amit was interested. Amit didn't call the number for 2 months. Money wasn't the issue yet. Pride was. He'd served Israel for 2 decades, first in military intelligence during the tense years of the 1960s and 70s, then in roles connected to Shin Bet's operations. He'd been good at his work. Excellent, even. But something had broken during a classified operation he still couldn't discuss, even under interrogation. He'd been shot. The wound left him partially disabled. He spent time in a military hospital, then a psychiatric facility for treatment the government called necessary, and he called imprisonment. When he returned to active duty, his commanders treated him differently. Assignments dried up, promotions stopped, he filed complaints claiming persecution, and got nowhere. The system he'd served had discarded him. That wound, physical and psychological, festered for years. So when money got tight and the resentment grew sharp, Amit called the number. A man answered in English and said he'd been waiting for Amit's call. 2 weeks later, Amit flew to Bonn on what he told his wife was a private investigation contract. The meeting took place in a safe house above a bookshop in a quiet residential neighborhood. 2 Americans were waiting. One introduced himself as Tom Waltz, though Amit suspected that wasn't his real name. Waltz worked for the CIA. He didn't pretend otherwise. The pitch was straightforward. The Americans wanted information about Israeli military operations, particularly in Lebanon, where Israeli forces were engaged in complex operations against Palestinian groups and Syrian forces. Waltz explained that intelligence sharing between allies was normal, but sometimes official channels moved too slowly, or political considerations blocked the flow of information that field operatives needed. Amit could help bridge that gap. The payment would be substantial. Waltz quoted a figure that was more than Amit made in a year of investigative work. Amit asked the obvious question, why would the Americans need to recruit someone if the intelligence relationship between the U.S. and Israel was so strong? Waltz's answer was practiced and smooth. Official sharing happened at high levels with political filters applied. What the CIA needed was ground truth, operational reality, the kind of tactical intelligence that never made it into formal briefings because bureaucrats sanitized everything. Amit could provide unfiltered assessments. And besides, Waltz said, with a slight smile, this wasn't really betrayal since America and Israel were allies working toward the same strategic goals. Amit would just be facilitating better coordination. The rationalization was thin, and Amit knew it. But the money was real, and so was his bitterness toward the commanders who'd sidelined him. He agreed to think about it. Waltz gave him a contact protocol, a phone number in Austria that would connect to an answering service, a simple code phrase to use, and instructions for a dead-drop location in Tel Aviv if communication needed to stay completely offline. Amit returned to Haifa and spent 2 weeks wrestling with the decision. In the end, the resentment won. He made the call. The problem was access. Amit no longer worked inside Israeli intelligence. He had connections, but no direct access to classified materials. He needed a source. He thought about his network, people from his military intelligence days, old colleagues who might be persuaded to share information. Most had moved on or retired. But there was one possibility that made Amit's chest tighten with guilt, even as he considered it. His childhood friend from Kiryat Bialik, who now worked in Shin Bet's research department. They'd known each other since they were boys, played soccer in the dusty streets of the same neighborhood, served in the military during the same years. The friendship had survived decades. Amit knew he could manipulate that trust. The first approach was subtle. Amit called his friend and suggested they meet for dinner, catch up on old times. They met at a restaurant in Haifa with a view of the port, and over grilled fish and wine, Amit mentioned his private investigation work. Said he was handling a complex case that required background research on security matters in Lebanon. Nothing classified, he claimed, just context and open source analysis that someone in Shin Bet's research department could easily provide. His friend was reluctant at first, said the materials Amit was asking about weren't exactly open source. But Amit pressed gently, reminding him they'd always helped each other, that this was just background research, that nothing would be compromised. The friend agreed to pull some unclassified reports. That was the crack in the dam. Over the following months, Amit's requests grew more specific and more sensitive. He asked for assessments of Israeli force deployments in southern Lebanon. He requested analysis of Palestinian group movements in the occupied territories. He claimed the information was needed to advise a private security client about regional stability. His friend provided documents, always with hesitation, always with assurances from Amit that the materials would stay confidential and serve legitimate purposes. The friend worked in research, not field operations, so he didn't have the operational security training to recognize what was happening. He was a document analyst, and his childhood friend was asking for documents. It seemed simple. It was anything but. Amit photographed the documents using a Minolta camera with high-speed film that Waltz had provided during a meeting in Frankfurt. The technique was standard espionage tradecraft: lay the document flat under good lighting, photograph each page, return the original before anyone noticed it was missing. Amit's friend never knew the documents left the building in Amit's briefcase, got photographed in Amit's apartment, and returned the next day. The film rolls went to dead-drop locations: a loose brick behind a dumpster near the Haifa port, a hollowed-out fence post in a park in Tel Aviv, a magnetic key holder attached under a bench at a bus stop in Jerusalem. Amit would load the drop and mark it ready using chalk marks on nearby walls, simple signals that his handler's courier would recognize. The courier would retrieve the film and leave payment in the same location, usually cash in American dollars, sometimes as much as $5,000 for a particularly valuable document set. The intelligence Waltz wanted most urgently involved Israeli operations in Lebanon. Israeli forces had been conducting operations against Palestinian Liberation Organization positions and dealing with Syrian military presence in the region. The tactical details were highly sensitive: troop movements, operational plans, intelligence assessments of enemy capabilities. Amit provided all of it through his friend's unwitting assistance. The documents included Shin Bet intelligence reports on Palestinian group activities, military intelligence assessments of Syrian intentions, and operational summaries that revealed Israeli tactical approaches. For the CIA, this was gold standard intelligence that would never flow through official channels because political sensitivities prevented that level of detailed sharing. Amit was giving the Americans an unfiltered view of Israeli operations, but his friend was starting to ask questions. Why did a private investigation require such detailed operational intelligence? Why was Amit so interested in current deployments rather than historical context? Amit deflected with increasingly elaborate lies, said his client was a major international corporation doing security risk assessments for operations in the Middle East, said the detailed current information was necessary to evaluate threat environments, said the work was time-sensitive and lucrative. His friend's doubt grew, but the friendship held, barely. Each time Amit asked for another document, the hesitation lasted longer. The friend suggested maybe Amit should go through official channels. Amit insisted that bureaucracy would kill the project timeline and begged for one more favor. The friend gave in. He always gave in. That was what broke Amit's heart, even as he exploited it. He was destroying the person who trusted him most. By early 1986, the operation had been running for nearly a year. Amit had passed dozens of documents, received tens of thousands of dollars in payment, and successfully maintained his cover story. But intelligence operations never stay secret forever. Someone was watching. Amit didn't know who or when the surveillance began, but later he would learn that a different friend, someone outside the intelligence community who knew about Amit's American contacts, had reported suspicions to Israeli security services. The tip was vague but concerning. Israeli counterintelligence began monitoring Amit's movements. They tracked his trips to Europe, photographed his meetings with Americans, and started working backward to identify his sources. The investigation took months. Israeli intelligence agencies moved slowly and carefully when investigating their own people, particularly someone like Amit, who had legitimate military intelligence credentials and could claim his contacts were related to his private investigation business. The breakthrough came when counterintelligence conducted a document audit at Shin Bet headquarters. They were looking for patterns of unauthorized access or unusual document requests. Amit's friend's name appeared repeatedly in access logs for highly classified materials that had no connection to his official duties. When questioned, the friend initially tried to protect Amit, saying he'd pulled the documents for legitimate research. But investigators pressed harder, and the friend's story collapsed. He admitted that Amit had requested the materials for private investigation work. Investigators pulled phone records, travel logs, and financial records. The pattern became clear. Amit was meeting with Americans in Europe. Classified documents were being accessed through his childhood friend. Money was flowing into Amit's bank accounts in amounts far exceeding his declared investigative work income. They had enough to arrest him. Shin Bet debated timing. They could arrest Amit immediately and secure whatever documents he currently possessed, or they could maintain surveillance and try to identify his handlers and the full network. The decision came down to risk assessment. If Amit suspected he was under investigation, he might flee or destroy evidence. The Americans might pull him out through diplomatic channels. Better to move quickly. They chose the parking lot because it was isolated, controllable, and Amit's apartment building had too many witnesses and escape routes. The operation was planned with the same precision Israeli intelligence applied to operations against hostile targets. 3 vehicles, 8 officers. Complete surprise. They executed perfectly. Now, Amit sat in the interrogation room, staring at the surveillance photographs from Bonn and Frankfurt and Tel Aviv. The interrogator asked again when it started. Amit closed his eyes and began talking. He admitted meeting with American intelligence officers. He admitted receiving payment for that information. He admitted using his childhood friend to access classified Shin Bet documents. He admitted photographing the materials and passing them through dead drops. What he wouldn't admit was that he'd done anything wrong. He claimed the Americans were allies, that intelligence sharing between allied nations was normal, that his information had helped coordination rather than compromised security. The interrogator listened without expression. When Amit finished his justification, the interrogator closed the folder and told him he'd be charged with espionage and treason. The case would be handled by military court under conditions of total secrecy. Military censorship would prevent any media coverage. Amit's name would disappear from public record. His family would be told nothing about the charges or the trial. He would simply vanish into the Israeli prison system. Amit asked about his friend. The interrogator's face showed the first hint of emotion: disgust. Amit's childhood friend had been arrested the same day. He'd confessed immediately to providing the documents, claiming he'd been deceived by Amit's lies about private investigation work. The friend would be sentenced to 3 months in prison, which would be suspended, but he'd be fired from Shin Bet and lose his security clearance permanently. His career was destroyed. His reputation was gone. And unlike Amit, the friend had been genuinely betrayed. He'd trusted someone he'd known since childhood and been used as an intelligence source without his knowledge or consent. That betrayal, the interrogator said, was in some ways worse than Amit's espionage. Amit had sold secrets for money. The friend had been tricked into destroying his own life. The interrogation continued for days. Amit was held in isolation, moved between facilities to prevent any contact with other prisoners or his family. His lawyer, appointed by the military court system, had limited access and even more limited ability to mount a defense under the secrecy rules. The evidence was overwhelming. Photographs, financial records, testimony from his friend, the documents found in his car. Amit's only possible defense was to claim mental incompetence due to his earlier psychiatric treatment, or to argue that he'd been coerced somehow into cooperation. Neither argument had merit. The psychiatric treatment had been years earlier, and Amit had been cleared for private work. No evidence suggested coercion. He'd acted voluntarily for money and resentment. The trial began in April 1987, more than a year after his arrest. The proceedings took place in a closed military courtroom with no media present, no family observers, and no public record. The judges were senior military officers with intelligence backgrounds. The prosecution presented a methodical case documenting every meeting, every document transfer, every payment. They produced the surveillance photographs from Europe. They brought in Amit's friend to testify about how Amit had manipulated him into providing classified materials. They presented financial records showing deposits into Amit's accounts that couldn't be explained by his declared investigative work. The CIA connection was never explicitly named in open court, but references to foreign intelligence services of an allied nation made the identity obvious. American officials had been quietly informed of Amit's arrest through diplomatic channels, and the CIA had pulled its officers from the operation immediately to avoid further embarrassment. Amit's defense was thin. His lawyer argued that Amit had suffered psychological trauma from his combat wound and subsequent mistreatment by military superiors, claimed the persecution he'd experienced had impaired his judgment, suggested the confession might have been obtained through interrogation methods that violated his rights. The judges weren't persuaded. Yes, Amit had been wounded. Yes, he'd been hospitalized. Yes, his career advancement had stalled. None of that justified espionage. The sentence came down in April 1987. 12 years in prison, just 3 years short of the maximum 15-year sentence for espionage. The verdict and sentence were classified. Israeli media were forbidden from mentioning Amit's name or the case details under military censorship rules that gave security services absolute control over intelligence-related reporting. To the Israeli public, Yosef Amit simply didn't exist. He was transferred to Ayalon prison, where high-security inmates served their sentences. His conditions were harsh. Some accounts suggest he was held in isolation for extended periods. Other reports claim he spent time in psychiatric wards within the prison system. Later, investigative journalists would allege that Amit faced mistreatment during detention, that his mental health deteriorated, that he was denied adequate medical care for his combat-related disabilities. These allegations came from Amit himself in interviews years later and from prison reform advocates who took up his case. Israeli authorities never confirmed or denied the treatment claims. Prison records remained sealed. Amit filed an appeal with Israel's Supreme Court, arguing that his confession had been coerced and that the trial hadn't met basic fairness standards given the secrecy conditions. The Supreme Court rejected his appeal in 1989. The justices found that military court procedures had been followed appropriately, that evidence supported the conviction regardless of the confession, and that national security considerations justified the secrecy. Amit would serve his sentence. But the case had created an awkward diplomatic situation. The CIA was furious that one of its intelligence operations had been exposed, even under classification. Israeli intelligence was angry that an insider had compromised sensitive operations to an ally who should have respected the boundaries of intelligence sharing. And both governments wanted the story buried completely to avoid public embarrassment and damage to the bilateral relationship. I have to pause here and ask you something. If you'd served your country for 20 years, been wounded in a secret operation they wouldn't even acknowledge, felt abandoned by commanders who sidelined you, and an allied intelligence service offered you money and a way to strike back, what would you have done? And here's the harder question. Would you have used your closest friend, someone who trusted you completely, to get the documents you needed? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm genuinely curious where you draw the line between justified grievance and unforgivable betrayal, because what Amit did destroyed more than just his own life. Here's what happened next. Amit spent the late 1980s and early 1990s in Ayalon prison, while the Israeli public remained completely unaware that a major espionage case involving American intelligence had even occurred. Journalists occasionally heard whispers about a classified spy case, but military censorship prevented publication of any details. Foreign media outlets picked up fragments of the story through intelligence sources, but without confirmation from Israeli authorities, the reporting remained vague and speculative. The secrecy served multiple purposes. Israeli intelligence didn't want to reveal how an insider had breached security through a personal network rather than direct access. The CIA didn't want public scrutiny of an operation that had recruited a friendly nation's intelligence officer, and both governments wanted to avoid questions about why allies were spying on each other in the first place. But by the early 1990s, the political calculation began to shift. Jonathan Pollard, an American naval intelligence analyst, had been convicted in the United States in 1987 for spying for Israel. The Pollard case had created enormous tension between the two countries, and Israel had been pushing for years to secure his release through diplomatic channels. Some Israeli officials floated the idea of a prisoner exchange, Yosef Amit for Jonathan Pollard. The proposal had a certain symmetry. Both men had spied for allied nations. Both had been convicted of espionage. An exchange would allow both governments to resolve embarrassing cases quietly. But the idea collapsed quickly for several reasons. Amit himself objected to being traded, reportedly saying he wanted to serve his sentence and be released on his own terms rather than become a bargaining chip. American officials were uninterested in the exchange because Pollard's case carried far more political weight in the United States, and trading him for an Israeli who'd spied for America made no sense politically. The Pollard connection did accomplish one thing, though. It reminded Israeli officials that keeping the Amit case completely secret might not remain possible forever, and they began planning for controlled disclosure. The breakthrough came in June 1993. Israeli authorities decided to partially lift military censorship and allow limited public acknowledgement of the case. The government issued a brief statement confirming that a former military intelligence officer named Yosef Amit had been convicted in 1987 on espionage charges and was serving a 12-year prison sentence. The statement was carefully worded. It mentioned contact with foreign intelligence services, but didn't name the United States. It referenced classified materials, but didn't specify which documents or operations had been compromised. It acknowledged the conviction but provided no details about trial proceedings or evidence. Israeli media, finally free to report something after 7 years of enforced silence, published stories based on the limited official statement and whatever fragments they'd gathered through unofficial sources over the years. The coverage was significant but incomplete. Most Israelis learned for the first time that a major espionage case had been prosecuted in total secrecy for years. American media picked up the story and immediately connected the dots that Israeli censors had left carefully blurred. Reports in the Washington Post and Los Angeles Times stated explicitly that Amit had been arrested for passing classified Israeli intelligence to the CIA and possibly to other NATO country services. The reporting cited American intelligence sources who confirmed that Amit had been a CIA asset who provided valuable intelligence about Israeli operations in Lebanon and the occupied territories. The stories emphasized the awkwardness of the situation. Allies spying on each other, prosecutions kept secret to avoid diplomatic damage, intelligence sharing that happened through espionage rather than official channels. For readers following the complex world of intelligence operations, the Amit case revealed an uncomfortable truth. Even the closest allies conducted espionage against each other when national interests or institutional priorities demanded it. 4 months after the public acknowledgement, In October 1993, Israeli authorities released Amit from prison. He'd served approximately 8 years of his 12-year sentence, a reduction justified by good behavior and psychological considerations. Prison officials noted that Amit had cooperated fully during his incarceration, caused no disciplinary problems, and continued to struggle with mental health issues related to his combat wound and the trauma of imprisonment. The decision to release him early was partially practical. Keeping him in prison served no additional security purpose since he was no longer a threat, and partially political. The case had become public anyway, and continuing to imprison him while the full story remained classified created ongoing questions and controversy. Better to release him quietly and let the story fade. Amit walked out of Ayalon prison into a very different Israel than the one he'd left. The Soviet Union had collapsed, ending the Cold War framework that had defined much of his military intelligence career. The Oslo Accords had just been signed, reshaping Israeli-Palestinian relations. The world had moved on while he sat in a cell. What happened to Amit after his release remains largely unknown. Israeli media reported that he relocated to protect his identity and lived under conditions designed to keep him out of public view. Some accounts suggested he attempted to rebuild his life through private work, though his espionage conviction made finding employment difficult. He gave a handful of interviews to investigative journalists over the years, particularly to reporters from Haaretz, who covered intelligence matters, but the interviews focused more on his allegations of mistreatment during detention and interrogation than on the substance of his espionage activities. Amit maintained until his death that his confession had been coerced, that his imprisonment conditions were brutal, and that he'd been scapegoated for activities that were common in intelligence circles. He never expressed meaningful remorse for betraying his country or for destroying his childhood friend's life. In his version of events, he was the victim, wounded in service, abandoned by commanders, persecuted by the system, and imprisoned under harsh conditions for activities that shouldn't have been criminal, since America and Israel were allies. The intelligence community saw things differently. Amit had exploited personal trust to access classified materials. He'd been paid tens of thousands of dollars for information he knew was highly sensitive. He'd used his friend as an unwitting source, lying repeatedly about his purposes and destroying that friend's career in the process. He'd operated as an intelligence asset for a foreign power, however allied that power might be. The fact that he'd spied for America rather than for a hostile nation didn't make the breach less serious in terms of security protocols and trust violations. Israeli intelligence implemented various reforms after the Amit case, though the details remained classified. Presumably, document access controls were tightened. Background checks and financial monitoring for personnel with security clearances were enhanced. Procedures for detecting internal leaks through personal networks rather than direct access were improved. The case became a teaching example in counterintelligence training about how motivated insiders could exploit relationships to breach security even without direct access to classified systems. The American side of the story remained mostly classified as well. The CIA never officially confirmed Amit's role as an asset, though intelligence reporters working from sources provided confirmation in various publications over the years. The agency presumably conducted its own internal review of the operation, examining how the recruitment had been handled, what intelligence value Amit's information had provided, and what operational security failures had allowed Israeli counterintelligence to identify and roll up the network. The case likely influenced CIA procedures for handling assets in allied countries where detection risk was particularly high and where diplomatic complications from exposure could damage important bilateral relationships. But without access to classified American records, the full scope of what Amit provided and how the CIA used his intelligence remains unknown. The damage assessment was never made public. Israeli intelligence conducted a detailed review of every document Amit had passed through his friend's access, evaluating what operational information had been compromised and what Israeli capabilities or intentions might have been exposed. Some of the intelligence concerned military operations that were already concluded by the time of Amit's arrest, limiting the damage. Other materials revealed ongoing intelligence collection methods and sources that had to be protected or altered once compromise was assumed. The troop movement information about Lebanon was particularly sensitive because it could have allowed adversaries who obtained the information through American leaks or intelligence failures to anticipate Israeli tactical approaches. The assessment remained classified, but intelligence officials suggested the damage was significant, though not catastrophic. No Israeli operations failed directly because of Amit's betrayal. No agents were killed or captured. But trust was damaged. Procedures had to be revised, and the bilateral intelligence relationship with the United States required rebuilding. For the childhood friend, life after the case was devastated. He'd been fired from Shin Bet, lost his security clearance permanently, and served the suspended sentence that hung over him like a permanent stain. His professional career in intelligence or security work was over. People who knew about the case viewed him as either a dupe or a traitor, depending on how much they believed his claims of having been deceived by Amit. The friendship that had lasted decades was destroyed completely. The friend gave no interviews and disappeared from public view even more thoroughly than Amit did. He'd been used, betrayed, and punished for trusting someone who'd known him since childhood. It was a particular kind of betrayal that cut deeper than traditional espionage because it involved personal intimacy rather than institutional loyalty. The larger questions raised by the Amit case remained unresolved. Why do allied nations spy on each other? The answer is partly practical. Intelligence needs don't always align with political relationships, and official sharing channels filter information in ways that don't serve every operational requirement. The CIA wanted unfiltered tactical intelligence about Israeli operations that wouldn't flow through diplomatic protocols. Israel presumably conducts similar intelligence collection against American interests when Israeli decision-makers need information that Washington won't share. The espionage relationship between allies is complex, characterized by both cooperation and competition, trust, and suspicion. Amit's case made that complexity visible in ways that were uncomfortable for both governments and for publics that preferred to think of allied relationships as completely aligned. The case also raised questions about insider threats and personal motivations. Amit wasn't motivated primarily by ideology or enemy allegiance. His motives were financial and personal: resentment toward commanders, desire for money, and perhaps a perverse satisfaction in striking back at a system he felt had wronged him. These motivations are common among insiders who betray their organizations. They feel undervalued, mistreated, or passed over for advancement, and espionage becomes a form of revenge as much as a financial opportunity. Preventing insider threats requires attention not just to external security measures, but to internal culture, personnel management, and psychological screening. Organizations need to identify personnel who are showing signs of resentment or financial stress before those factors metastasize into betrayal. The secrecy surrounding the trial and the 7-year censorship period demonstrated how intelligence agencies prioritize protecting sources, methods, and diplomatic relationships over public transparency. From a security perspective, the secrecy made sense, revealing details about how Amit operated, who his handlers were, and what specific documents he compromised could have exposed other vulnerabilities and damaged intelligence relationships beyond repair. But from a democratic accountability perspective, the secrecy prevented public discussion of significant security failures and raised questions about whether the military court system provided adequate due process when proceedings were completely hidden from scrutiny. Amit's allegations about coerced confessions and harsh prison treatment couldn't be evaluated publicly because all evidence remained classified. The balance between security and transparency remains unresolved in cases like this. 30 years later, many details about the Amit case remain classified or unknown. The full scope of documents he passed to the CIA hasn't been disclosed. The specific intelligence operations that may have been compromised are still secret. Amit's handlers within the CIA were never officially identified beyond the single name, possibly Tom Waltz, that appeared in investigative reporting without official confirmation. The damage assessment conducted by Israeli intelligence hasn't been made public, and Amit's life after his 1993 release from prison remains mostly unknown. He lived quietly, gave occasional interviews that focused on his grievances rather than his crimes, and died without providing a full accounting of his espionage activities or expressing meaningful remorse for the betrayals he committed. The case remains a black box in many respects, visible in outline but opaque in detail. What we know creates a disturbing picture of how personal resentment can lead to betrayal, how trust can be weaponized against the people who extend it, and how intelligence operations between allies can be just as ruthless as operations between adversaries. Amit was a wounded veteran who felt abandoned by his commanders and exploited that grievance to justify selling secrets to a foreign power. His childhood friend was a loyal analyst who trusted someone from his past and paid for that trust with his career and reputation. The American intelligence officers were professionals pursuing their mission of collecting information their government wanted, regardless of whether that collection crossed ethical lines in allied relationships. And the Israeli security services were protectors of secrets who prosecuted Amit in secrecy to prevent further damage, even if that secrecy raised questions about justice and due process. What remains fascinating about the Amit case is how it resists simple narratives. Amit wasn't a pure villain. He genuinely had been wounded in service and may have been mistreated by superiors. But neither was he a victim. He chose to exploit his friend, accepted money for betrayal, and showed little remorse afterward. The CIA officers weren't necessarily villains either. They were following orders to collect intelligence, though targeting an allied nation's officer crossed ethical boundaries. Amit's friend was genuinely innocent, but his willingness to bend rules and provide documents to someone outside official channels showed poor judgment even if he'd been deceived about the purpose. Every participant in the case existed in moral gray zones where loyalty, betrayal, duty, grievance, and institutional priorities created impossible choices and devastating consequences. The Amit affair teaches uncomfortable lessons about the espionage world. Trust is currency that can be counterfeited. Allies spy on each other when interests diverge. Personal grievances can override national loyalty. Security clearances don't prevent betrayal when human factors create vulnerability. And secrecy, while necessary for intelligence operations, can also hide uncomfortable truths about how intelligence agencies operate and what moral compromises they make in pursuit of information. Yosef Amit walked out of Ayalon prison in October 1993 and disappeared into the anonymity that Israeli authorities had been protecting throughout his imprisonment. The briefcase they found in his car trunk in that Haifa parking lot 7 years earlier had contained secrets that exposed operations and damaged relationships. But the bigger secret, the one that governments on both sides wanted to keep hidden, was that the espionage game between allies could be just as ruthless and morally complex as espionage between enemies. Amit took most of his full story with him into the shadows where he lived the rest of his life. The classified files remain sealed, the damage assessment stays secret. The full truth about exactly what he passed, to whom, and with what consequences will likely remain locked in intelligence archives for decades more. That's the nature of spy stories involving allied nations. The public gets the outline, but the details, the real story of betrayal and cost and consequence, stays hidden behind classification stamps and diplomatic sensitivities. What we're left with is a cautionary tale about how wounded pride, personal resentment, and financial need can turn a decorated officer into a traitor, and how the closest friend can become the unwitting instrument of betrayal.